A lot of people born between 1976 and 1985 feel like they've lived two completely different lives without ever leaving the same lifetime. You remember rewinding VHS tapes. You remember house phones attached to walls. You remember disappearing for hours without anyone knowing where you were. But you also watched the internet arrive. You watched the world become permanent, connected, fast, and loud. And psychologically, that changes people more than most realize. Because Xennials didn't just grow up during change. You grew up inside the transition itself. And that may be why so many Xennials today feel emotionally tired, strangely nostalgic, disconnected from modern culture, yet still capable of adapting to almost anything. So in this video, we're going to explore the psychology of Xennials, not just what this generation experienced, but how those experiences quietly shaped the way they think, feel, connect, trust, work, and survive in the modern world. What makes this generation fascinating is that your childhood existed in one reality, and your adulthood exists in another. Most generations slowly adapt to change over time. But Xennials experienced one of the fastest cultural transformations in human history, right in the middle of developing their identity. And identity matters. Psychologists often describe your late teens and 20s as the period where your brain is building its long-term understanding of the world. How relationships work, how safety works, how society works, what success means, who you are. But for Xennials, the rules changed halfway through the game. When you were young, life moved slower. If someone embarrassed themselves at school, eventually people forgot. If you had a bad haircut, an awkward phase, a painful breakup, it disappeared into memory. Your mistakes were temporary. Today, people grow up with permanent documentation, photos, videos, messages, digital footprints. But Xennials experienced something unique, a childhood that faded naturally, and an adulthood that became permanently recorded. That creates a completely different relationship with memory and identity, because memory was once emotional. Now it's archived, and many Xennials subconsciously feel that difference. You also grew up before constant stimulation became normal. Boredom used to exist, and boredom sounds insignificant, until you realize boredom was where imagination lived. You waited for things. You sat quietly sometimes. You stared out car windows. You learned patience because there was no alternative. Today, silence itself almost feels uncomfortable. Phones fill every empty second. Algorithms compete for attention every minute. Modern life rarely allows the brain to rest naturally. And this is where many Xennials experience a strange, emotional conflict. Part of you genuinely loves modern convenience. You appreciate technology. You adapted to it quickly. But another part of you misses something you can't fully explain. Not necessarily the old technology itself, but the feeling that came with it. A slower emotional rhythm. A world that felt less performative. Conversations that disappeared instead of being screenshotted forever. Friendships that existed without notifications. Moments that belonged only to the people inside them. Xennials remember what human interaction felt like before everyone became constantly reachable. And psychologically, that memory matters. Because once you've experienced both versions of reality, you start noticing what was gained and what was lost. That's why many Xennials feel disconnected from modern online culture. Not because they hate technology, but because they remember life before identity became branding, before people curated personalities for strangers, before every opinion became public performance, before being busy became a status symbol. Xennials grew up during a time where people still separated private life from public life, and today those boundaries barely exist anymore. Another reason this generation feels emotionally different is because of timing. Xennials entered adulthood during enormous instability. Many graduated into economic uncertainty, rising costs, job insecurity, financial pressure, the collapse of long-term stability people once expected. You were raised believing hard work created security. Then adulthood arrived. And suddenly, loyalty didn't guarantee stability anymore. That contradiction affects people deeply. Research on stress and economic instability shows that uncertainty during early adulthood can permanently shape the nervous system's relationship with safety. Even years later, many people continue living as though disaster might happen again at any moment. And if you're a Xennial, you probably understand that feeling. Even when life is okay, part of your brain stays prepared for things to collapse. So many Xennials became hyper-adaptable. You learned how to reinvent yourself, learn new systems, switch careers, handle rapid change, keep functioning under pressure. But adaptation has a hidden psychological cost. When people constantly adapt, they sometimes forget what feeling settled even feels like. And maybe that's why so many Xennials feel mentally exhausted today. Not weak, not incapable, just tired from continuously adjusting to a world that never stopped changing. What's interesting is that Xennials often carry traits from both neighboring generations. You have some of Gen X's independence and skepticism, but also some of millennials' emotional openness and digital fluency. You understand offline life, but you also understand online culture. You can navigate technology without fully belonging to it emotionally. And that creates a strange in-between identity, too young to fully relate to older generations, too old to feel naturally connected to younger ones. Xennials often feel like observers standing between two worlds, and maybe that's why nostalgia hits this generation so intensely. Because nostalgia isn't always about wanting the past back. Sometimes nostalgia is grief for a version of life that disappeared quietly. The last truly offline childhood, the last era before constant comparison, the last time people could disappear for a few hours without anxiety. Xennials remember that world vividly, and unlike older generations, you also witnessed exactly how fast it vanished. That creates emotional whiplash. One moment the world felt grounded and local, then suddenly everything became global, digital, immediate, and overwhelming. And humans were never psychologically designed to process this much information this quickly. Yet, somehow, Xennials adapted anyway. That may actually be the defining psychological trait of this generation. Quiet resilience. Not loud resilience. Not motivational quote resilience. But the kind where people simply keep going. Keep adjusting. Keep carrying responsibilities without announcing it. A lot of Xennials became emotionally self-reliant because they had to. You solved problems alone. You entertained yourself alone. You learned not to expect constant emotional validation. And while that independence creates strength, it can also create loneliness. Because people who become good at handling everything themselves often struggle to feel emotionally understood by others, especially in a culture that changes faster every year. And maybe this is why so many Xennials crave peace now more than excitement. not because they stopped caring about life, but because their nervous systems are tired of constant noise. You notice many Xennials dreaming about quiet homes, slow mornings, smaller social circles, privacy, nature, distance from chaos. That isn't laziness. Psychologically, it may actually be recovery. Recovery from decades of overstimulation, uncertainty, and adaptation. The fascinating thing about Xennials is this. You remember enough of the old world to question the new one, but you adapted enough to survive inside it. And honestly, that perspective might become more valuable in the future than people realize. Because the world keeps changing faster. AI, automation, digital identity, virtual relationships, constant connectivity, and younger generations may eventually experience the same exhaustion Xennials already understand. But Xennials learned something important early. Technology can improve life without replacing humanity itself. And maybe that balance is the real lesson this generation carries. Not rejecting progress, not worshipping the past, just remembering that humans still need slowness, privacy, real conversations, boredom, presence, silence, the things modern culture keeps accidentally removing. If you're a Xennial and this resonated with you, you're probably not imagining the disconnect you feel. You really did grow up in a completely different psychological world than the one we live in now. And surviving that transition shaped you in ways most people never notice. Not better, not worse, just different. A generation raised between analog humanity and digital reality. And maybe that's exactly why Xennials understand both worlds better than almost anyone else. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more psychology and generational deep dives. And if there's another generation or psychological topic you want explored next, let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.